Okay, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for FGS Global for hosting this event in this beautiful building. So let's start. Of course, today's event it's about the tariffs and trade. It's the talk of the town right now. Everyone is just talking about it. There's a lot of gray areas that people want to learn more about. I know we don't have all the answers to this, but we're going to try to get some questions answered, right? So we have in this panel, let's start with me. I'm the bureau chief for Agencia EFE, which is the largest news agency in the Spanish-speaking world. Thank you, Jose, for hosting me, for having me in this panel. This is something that, of course, interests us a lot. So we have here Jose Parra. You can introduce yourself if you want.
Well, first of all, thank you all for coming. I'm Jose Parra. I head FGS Prospero, which is the Hispanic market division of FGS Global. And we integrated with FGS in 2023. Before that, I had my own firm, Prospero Latino. And before that, I served as senior aide to Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid. I spent 7 years in the Hill, and I started my career as a reporter in the South Florida area with the Sun Sentinel and the Miami Herald way back when the 2000 recount was taking place, which some of you may remember, others may not. And thank you all for coming. I appreciate the panelists. David, thank you so much for making the time for this. Sarah, an expert especially on the relationship with China and all the dynamics we're seeing here, and of course Matt Skaiser, who has a very interesting point of view from the EU, and as a matter of fact, he worked in the Bundestag, in the German Parliament. And we look forward to a very interesting panel. I don't know whether we'll have all the answers, but we'll definitely tackle them.
Yeah, that's the whole point of this. We have an hour and around 30 minutes. We're gonna do some Q&A as well. So everyone is happy to participate. And let's start with Matt. If you can give us a little bit of an introduction of what you do and what is your expertise.
Sure, happy to. Yeah, Matt Kaiser, I'm partner here in DC. I've been with the firm for 16 years now, 15 years of that out of Europe. So I started working in Frankfurt, in the Frankfurt office, working on M&A transactions and the political aspects of M&A. Worked in Berlin for a couple of years, worked a lot at the intersection of geopolitics, international investments, policy risk that have increased obviously over time. Worked in Brussels for a couple of years, and since last year I'm here in Washington, D.C. and work with our global geopolitical risk and policy risk team to help clients, mainly corporates, but also institutional investors, navigate the geopolitical landscape. And of course, a key part of that is the trade landscape that we're discussing today.
Okay, so we have here Sarah, which is our DC insider. If you can give us a little bit of an introduction and an overview.
Yes, happy to. Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Trister. I'm a managing director here at FGS in the Washington, D.C. office. I spent about 13 years on Capitol Hill working for Senate and House Democrats on foreign policy and national security. I spent my last 3 years in the Senate working specifically on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee panel on East Asia and the Pacific. So focusing a lot on U.S. relationship with China and the Asia-Pacific region. Pleased to be here.
Thank you. David, if you can give us an introduction.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming as well. I'm an attorney with a firm called Sandler, Travis & Rosenberg. Our specialty and sole focus is international trade. That's all we do. And for the first 10 years of my career, I was specialized in policy and lobbying issues related to trade, legislation related to trade. And over the last 10 years, I've also shifted and added the operational legal part of things and the actual movement of the goods coming in and out and what it means for the importer. So it's a pleasure to be here. I look forward to the conversation.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. So as you see, we have a lot of expertise here on this table. I wanted to start with the news of the day. there's been an announcement that there's a framework between China and the U.S. for a trade deal. Trump just tweeted or went to Truth Social and said that there's a 55% for tariff for China. There's an agreement on rare earth, which is a very important component of all the industrial sectors that are important right now, and that the U.S. will only have to pay a 10%. This is not clear yet. I know there's a lot of, as I said, gray areas, a lot of uncertainty around this. I don't know, Matt, if you can comment on the multilateral relations, what we are seeing here with these bilateral trades, these conversations, this intention that Trump will try to get 90 trade deals in 90 days, that it's obviously not happening, and how is that going to affect the geopolitical risk and the global order?
Happy to. So I think the positive news of the day is that we have progress. I think that is something that's important. I would caution a little bit, and obviously we don't have many details, as with many of the announcements of recent weeks, we don't have many details in the overall trade discussions that have been going on. But I would caution a little bit. Trump posted this morning and said we have a deal. If I read the Chinese statements relating to this, it looks more like what we have is indeed a framework combined with hope that we have a baseline for further discussions, and that we have hopefully at least averted the biggest immediate crisis that there was out there, which you refer to, rare earth material supplies. Interesting piece will be, it was mentioned, export controls, which the Chinese side is very interested in, whether there's any changes to the US approach to that. But that's, of course, is the very baseline. And if I just read between the lines, my sense is this is very much about trying to bring in some trust foundations into what is an overall very, very mistrustful or relationship between China and the US at this point. And I think if we widen the lens a little bit, I think that is one of the biggest issues at the moment for the global economy overall, is kind of a lack of trust, the level of uncertainty that investors are facing, that companies are facing at the moment. And I think this is something that is key for the upcoming weeks and months, and everyone is looking towards that. Will we come to a point where uncertainty dissipates a bit, where we have a bit more visibility? And then the second question is more fundamentally, everyone, I think, is now assuming that we will have more friction and more fragmentation going forward. I mean, by all accounts, tariff levels are not going to go down immediately. They're probably, from the levels that we've seen over the last 30 years, they are going up. I always tend to think of like the bigger, longer term perspective is when I grew up, 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, and I was in East Germany, and so I was a beneficiary of all the globalization that we've seen. Global GDP growth since then, since 1989, was bigger worldwide than any GDP growth we had in history before. And if you want to put that in financial numbers, the S&P 500 since 1989 grew 3,800%. And now we all know this has not been distributed evenly, which is why we've had backlash and why we have this desire and voting mandate, not only in the US, but also in other economies, to change some of the trade dynamics and rebalance trade. But I think it mustn't be forgotten that overall, on aggregate, this has been a tremendously positive era that we've been through. And the big question is, I think, where are we going from here? What's the new baseline level? There will be changes. There will be more frictions, as geopolitical competition is clearly impacting the decision-making among governments. The question is just what's going to be the next baseline, and will it be a baseline that will help economies like the US, also in Europe and in other economies, to reshore some of the production, to secure more of the industrial base at home. But there will be a cost to that ultimately, and I think the question is just how high will that cost be, and what will be the new balance. Maybe I'll leave it at that for the start.
Okay. All right, so Sarah, you've been working, you have worked in Congress for over 10 years on foreign policy and how trade affects foreign policy. Can you give us a little bit more of your thoughts on what are the next steps that we're going to see here in this back and forth between China and the U.S.? And if you can comment on how both Beijing and Washington are selling this as a victory, and how these two strongmen try to sell that at home.
Yes, it's a good question, and it's kind of the fundamental question, right? Is what is the in Washington, in the United States, it's a political base. In China, it's maybe the party base and others, but what is the goal and what is the outcome of this entire process? And I think that's been a little bit unclear. Maybe that's a little generous. Different people in the administration at different times have used the tariffs for different things, and they've framed them as achieving different goals. And they can't do all things all the time. You can't increase tariffs and prevent goods from coming in and also help small businesses meet their needs. And you can't use tariffs as leverage for trade deals and then also keep them kind of artificially high. And so you can't do all things all the time. And so I think what we're seeing, what I'm looking for right now is, where does the administration kind of settle on this policy? What is the ultimate goal here? My own view is that Trump inherently views the kind of current framework for trade as unfair to the United States. And that's kind of the underlying thesis that has kind of pushed all of this, all of the trade policy. And I don't think that's going to change. He wants to see the United States kind of take back control of its trade policy, with the stated goal of bringing more manufacturing to the United States, helping American workers, helping businesses, helping farmers. How he's able to implement that, I think, remains to be seen, but he needs to be able to show, I think, to his party and to the voters that he's achieved some kind of a win. And I think we saw that with the UK deal. A lot of the details are still unclear. Some of what they agreed to were things that were kind of already in process and not necessarily new, but he was able to show that they came to the table and he achieved a win through this policy. And I think that's what he's looking to do. And so if he's able to sell the China deal as a win here, as a win to his party, as a win to his base, then I think he's mostly satisfied. Now, does that satisfy Peter Navarro, his trade advisor at the White House? Does that satisfy Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, who's pretty hawkish on China? I don't know. And maybe it doesn't matter, because there's really one audience here in the United States, and that's Trump. He's the decider. And that's what he said on Truth Social is, if President Xi and I agree, then the deal is done. Doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. And so, he is influenced by outside factors like the bond market, like public polling, probably to a lesser extent the US Congress and the members of Congress. But he is influenced, and so I think we need to see how are the economic indicators here in the United States over the next few days, weeks, and months. What does the polling look like? How much appetite is there in Congress for the volatility that's been going on? And particularly as we get closer to the next election, which will be in November of 2026, what are individual members of Congress hearing from their own communities, their own constituents about trade policy? So far, Trump's base, very supportive of what he's been doing. And if that holds, then I think we'll see his own willingness to kind of withstand the ups and downs continue to hold as well.
All right. David, so today we also heard news that the inflation is not as serious as we thought at the beginning. The tariff seems to not be affecting prices that much. How are companies or clients here in DC planning for the medium longer term, considering all these policy changes?
Yeah, it's a really fun time to be an advisor and attorney on tariffs. And by fun, I mean I don't get to see my family very much anymore, and I'm at the office 20 hours a day. I'll start by saying that we don't yet fully know the impact of the tariffs, starting with the fact that, at least for the trade, let's look first at trade data before I get into importers' strategies. The data that we have right now, it's about 2 months behind, and the best we have right now is April data, which is already skewed because in March there was a big impulse to get products into the United States. So we saw a rise of imports before the Liberation Day was coming on April the 2nd. And then in April, we do see a decrease of about 12% in average compared to what was coming in from, at least, I was looking at Latin American numbers, compared to what's coming in March. But again, the March numbers were already inflated to begin with. So we don't yet seem to have a very good detail of, all right, the trade deficit is coming down, but is that because it was so high to begin with? That picture at the macro level is unclear. Now, at the importer level, we do have importers who are trying to figure out ways to decrease costs by looking into things they never looked at before. For example, many electronic products were duty-free up until Liberation Day. Importers were not really worried about classification very much, and does it go here, does it go there? It doesn't matter because it's duty-free. If a product was produced in 3 different countries, importers weren't really that concerned about what's the true country of origin that you declare at customs, because it didn't matter where it came from generally. Of course, some of it's from China, but generally so now the importers, the businesses are really investing in, we need to understand everything that's in this product, we need to understand how it's made, we need to know what determines the origin of this product. If it's a toothbrush and I have a handle and a head of the toothbrush and they're made in different countries, what's the true origin of this? And if it has a motor that is from a third country, where do I go? So a lot of the conversations that you have at that level, that granular level, it's all about details on the product. It's all about the supply chain of the product. It's also of the valuation of the product. The United States has certain valuation rules at import that are a little bit different than other countries. So how do we use that to the best of our advantage? Of course, when you start planning for one thing, and then the next day it changes, right? Let's talk, for example, about the steel tariffs that change. So companies looked at that 25% tariff as of last week, making arrangements and trying to address and lower the impact as much as possible. And then suddenly the world changed about 4 days ago, where the Trump administration says, actually, you now pay for some of these products, you're now going to pay 50% tariff. However, you're only going to pay it on the steel or aluminum part, and you don't have to pay, and then on the remaining part, you now have to pay the reciprocal tariff rate. So now it's a new world. And for many companies, it's actually a good thing. For many companies, it's actually better to pay a higher tariff on the steel portion or aluminum portion, because they only have to declare the value of what was paid to the seller of the steel. So if I bought steel from company A and I make something out of it, now I don't have to declare the value of my finished product and pay a 50% of that. I can declare the value of the steel that I purchased before I transform it into something else. And even though the tariff is 50%, again, I'm paying on the raw material now. And the reciprocal tariff at the moment is 10%. So now it's a lot of conversations of, oh, we were going right and now we go left. So it's a big dance on a day-to-day for companies that are trying to predict and trying to react to what's happening right now. Now, as far as predictions, it's impossible, as we just saw from this morning. Now there's a deal. What does that mean? At least, again, for China. It truly is impossible to predict. There's a lot of concern about what's going to happen on July 9, as far as potential increases or not, as far as what countries are negotiating, what countries in Latin America are on the table, which ones are not, which ones are the good guys, which ones are the not so good guys, what's happening with other investigations that were announced, like supposedly there was going to be a tariff on countries that buy petroleum from Venezuela, or oil from Venezuela. That's out there, but it hasn't continued. There is an investigation on copper. There's an investigation on critical minerals that could result in tariffs. So it's very uncertain. You can only react to what's in front of you today, and then take it from there, day to day.
All right, so you mentioned that new world, that things are changing day to day. Jose, you have a lot of experience of U.S. policy making over many decades. And can you comment on this new world where we are paying attention to Truth Social to understand what's going to happen next day with something so impactful and so relevant as a tariff policy and trade policy, and how difficult it is for people here in Washington, D.C. to make decisions?
Yes. So the decision-making process in the U.S. obviously has undergone a paradigm shift, and not just within the last, not just in November or even in 2016. It's something that's been evolving before. Obviously, as David said, many of those decisions are being made on the fly through social media, as you just mentioned, and that injects that much more volatility into markets, into monetary policy and investment direction flows, et cetera, et cetera. What's interesting to me is that this reality in Washington from the outside is often misunderstood. For example, just put a finer point on it. A couple of months ago, I saw an op-ed by a renowned economist from Spain who was looking at U.S. trade policy, and he dusted off a economic model from the 1940s to explain that the United States was looking to expand its hegemony through the world, and that there was a concerted plan behind all this. But the issue with those sort of predictions is that, A, they're very rigid, as elegant as they might be in their formulation. But there are, that might have worked in 1944 when the world countries got together for Bretton Woods and set monetary policy and trade and the architecture that would eventually underpin the world that we see today. But you start getting into, you have so many other factors that didn't exist back then. The GOP base is a good example of that, as Sarah was describing earlier. And the Democratic base as well. There are a couple of phenomena, for example, in the United States that affect the decision-making because of the base. One, something that I haven't seen that much in other countries is gerrymandering, this practice of taking congressional districts and drawing them in order to concentrate your voters in that district and maintain power for the incumbent. And both parties are guilty of that. And that has contributed to the polarization that in effect channels into policy formulation in the U.S. The other one was the Citizens United decision in 2010 by the Supreme Court, which basically allowed a deluge of money, often without not knowing who is putting the money forth, into elections throughout the country. That further polarized things. And of course, I'm not saying that polarization is something that it's only an issue here in the U.S. Obviously, we see it in other parts. In Spain, we've seen the big clash between the two leading parties, El PP and PSOE, just recently. In Colombia, we saw the assassination attempt on a president's candidate over the weekend, unfortunately. But in the U.S., there's those special dynamics that unless you follow them and understand them, it's difficult to predict, to explain, and let alone predict where you're going. And all we're left at the end of the day are the social media posts to try to make sense of that.
So, as we see, this is very complex. Obviously, Trump is using trade as a way to start a debate, in a way, a global debate on other issues. I know you know a lot about the transatlantic relationship, how security also plays a role here, how this traditional alliance is now being challenged with Europe. Can you comment on that as well?
For sure, yeah. I think that is one of the interesting, relatively new developments, the linkage of trade with other non-traditionally trade-related arenas, right? Whether that is fentanyl here in the US, the immigration debate, Chinese students, which were part of the agreement this morning, and then as regards Europe, at least also that's almost part of Europe's solution package, defense spending, right? Linking trade to defense spending. If you want to put a bright spot on this or find like some kind of silver linings in all this, I would say from looking at Europe, two positive things have been A, with all this uncertainty that came with the Trump administration and this real sense that A, we don't know where this transatlantic relationship is going to go in the future. So Europeans need to get their act together, both on defense and also on thinking about where's growth going to come from. I mean, one of the interesting things that I observed having moved to the US fairly recently is that you here in the US have this debate about what's wrong with the US economy and trade needing rebalancing and so on. And in Europe, we've had a discussion over the last year with like several of economist reports as the new commission came in about Europe's loss of competitiveness, right? And we always look to the US and said, how can it be that at the time of the financial crisis, Europe's economy had the same size as the US economy, and since the financial crisis, the US economy has paced away, and Europe has essentially remained fairly flat since then. So one of the silver linings, I think, is the German fiscal package that came out of it, that really has reinvigorated interest among investors to see potential in Europe's economy, to see potential investment projects. And the other piece is, of course, the defense piece. And to your point, we've got the NATO summit coming up next month. And my sense is that there are variations within Europe as to which countries are willing to shoulder how much. But overall, given from where we're coming from this, so can Europe actually achieve the 2% rate? Now we seem to have a pretty consistent consensus around 3.5%, and then you add the non-directly linked defense pieces to add to 5%. And I think that is something that is, I think, overall will benefit the economy, will create and reinvigorate some growth, but also is much needed. And there is at least, I mean, it's not unanimously, but there is growing consensus among Europe's population as well to kind of see the benefits of increased fiscal spend and increased spend in defense.
All right, I want to move to China again. This vision that Trump seems to have, that decoupling with China is possible, that a world can be, that we can have a world where there are at least two poles, the US and their allies and China and their area of influence. But we also see, I don't know, Apple, for example, is such a big company, being so invested in China that it seems now impossible for that to happen. What is your opinion on that?
So I think it's an interesting question because Trump in many ways I think is less ideological than a lot of members of the Republican Party in the United States who've been talking about China over the last 5 to 10 years. A couple of years ago, certainly during the Biden administration, Republicans and many Democrats were talking about China as the existential threat to the United States, both from an economic, military, security, and in some ways, you know, as we saw through the pandemic, in a people standpoint. That does not seem to be undergirding the conversation right now, and which is interesting because, you know, when I worked on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, we considered legislation that would have, you know, potentially upended the U.S. position on Taiwan, and really viewed the China threat to Taiwan as an existential crisis that could force the U.S. and China into a military conflict within 5 years. I'm not hearing that a lot in the discussion right now. That doesn't mean there aren't people within the U.S. military and defense establishment that still feel that way. There certainly are. But the defense and kind of hard security aspect has really been kind of pushed to the side in favor of the economic and big picture geostrategic competition piece, which really I think shows how much we've moved into reliance on each other's technologies, economies, in a way that just doesn't doesn't hold up to kind of the old paradigms that we thought about when it comes to the US versus China or the US versus the Soviet Union. It's a different world now. And so this idea that we can decouple completely from China, I think, is largely gone. Even when you look at the things that Trump's senior advisors are saying or members of Congress are saying, they're still very focused on particular sectors. So we're focused on AI, on semiconductors, on some of the very specific technologies that have been subject to export controls. So I think there's been a shift to more of a strategic and very focused, to use the Biden administration phrase, de-risking versus a complete decoupling. And you see that in Trump's own statements. I mean, now he's this morning talking about allowing Chinese students back into United States universities. And so I don't think that he has an ideological viewpoint on complete decoupling from China the way that some in his party do. Now, the question to me going forward is, where does that go within the Republican Party? And to some extent within the Democratic Party as well. So are you going to see kind of the China hawks on Capitol Hill willing to digest a strategic relationship with China in certain areas? Are export controls on the table? We don't know if that's really been discussed in the context of this current framework. And I think that's where you could start to see a little bit of disagreement from some of the president's own party members. But I think that will be on the margins, and I think he's left a lot of room for his, the ability to kind of negotiate within that. I don't view it as being a huge rift in the party anytime soon, but I do think it's going to be interesting to see how members of Congress and others in the Republican kind of hawkish establishment look at this framework and are willing to kind of work with it going forward.
So we are limited in time, but I wanted to touch also on Mexico and the North American trade deal, which is super important and one of the, in my opinion, one of the successful stories of trade deals out there beside the European Union maybe. But how this is gonna evolve and how, for example, Claudia Sheinbaum is handling this relationship with Trump, which is, in my opinion, very interesting and very strategic as well.
The USMCA is the greatest trade deal that President Trump made until he said it wasn't. So it's very odd that we're in a situation where I've been working on trade agreements since 2005, so I saw the lobbying and ultimate ratification of agreements like Korea, Colombia, Peru, Panama, and there's always so much tension to get these agreements through the finish line. Labor issues, environmental issues versus free trade issues, and of course the negotiation of the agreement itself on issues like intellectual property and specific market access issues. USMCA passed with incredible bipartisan support. It was wonderful to see, and it was supposed to set the stage for our trade relation moving forward. But as Sarah mentioned, President Trump doesn't have a particular attachment to a policy and or a legal agreement if it's in the way of him trying to get something else, right? So under USMCA, of course, it is the most important agreement in terms that Mexico has. It's the most. The U.S. is the most important bilateral trade relationship with Mexico. In terms of U.S. imports from the Latin American region, just what comes from Mexico is about 75% of everything that comes from Latin America, and of course all of that is embedded in a great deal into the USMCA. But the president has threatened to also pull out of that agreement, as he did with the NAFTA, if he doesn't get certain concessions. And I think the Mexican president has masterfully worked with that, because I think you have to know that President Trump, at this point, we all know that he puts the bar very high, and he's gonna cry about things and complain about things. And normally you pay attention to that. You say that the head of state of the United States is very concerned about this issue. but he's concerned about it today, and as long as you can pacify him, or as long as you can provide something that he can now sell back to say, there was this problem, I fixed it, let's move on to the next thing. He just wants to fix, he wants to be able to sell something, he wants to be able to sell this is fixing issues. And I think the correct reaction on the part of other countries is to try to work with that and see what you can give, which may not be seen as a lot, right? Like maybe you're seeing like you're increasing border security, which you were already going to do to begin with, and it was already agreed, but now he can sell that, right? So she's been able to navigate those paths. I have 5 kids, so they get, sometimes you just have to let them go through their issues and then deal with it afterwards. So she's been able to navigate that. Now, reality is there are a lot of things that are in the USMCA that are now subject to tariffs under other issues, like the auto tariffs under 232, 25%, auto parts as well. And how does that play out with the agreement itself? So you have a trade agreement in which you lower tariffs, which, by the way, is supposed to go on the review next year. But then you have all these other tariffs that you're imposing on that country for matters like that are considered national security or likewise. So presently, where we have landed is that so long as, at least for the IEPA, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act tariffs against Mexico, we landed that so long as the product meets the USMCA requirements, you don't have to pay that tariff. Of course, there are many Mexican products, as I mentioned before, that companies were not really concerned about whatever the requirement was, but now they are, or they can't meet that requirement for X or Y reason. So then moving forward, again, what happens to the USMCA? How does it connect with these other tariffs that Trump has in place? Can we bind President Trump to this agreement so that everything that needs to be resolved within the trade relations with Mexico, in this case, or Canada, is dealt within the framework of that agreement? Or is he always going to be volatile and we just have to live with that in order to have some sense of stability that is built in the USMCA as a whole? So again, very, very live issue. With the USMCA as a whole being reviewed next year, and of course, without any point Trump being upset about something and President Mexico having to come in and calm things down, perhaps.
All right. He seems to be a lot of times upset about immigration. You're saying this is not ideological, but it seems to be pretty ideological when it comes to immigration. And it's a strategy, I suppose, for him to take these emergency powers that he's using to make policy. Can you comment on that as well before we move to closing remarks?
Yeah. Before I move on that topic, I'd like to put a finer point on what David just said. And your question about the Mexican president. Indeed, it has been a masterful dance because personality, as Sarah mentioned earlier, is a factor that has taken a much more salient position today than it has at any time in the past in any type of negotiation or multilateral or bilateral cooperation between countries. We have to remember that she is walking a tightrope where nationalist sentiment in Mexico is just as strong as in the U.S. Many people in Mexico still haven't forgotten the Mexican-American War where they lost more than half of the territory. So she has to show that she's defending Mexico's interests while at the same time ensuring that she's not antagonizing Trump unnecessarily. And she's tested every day. I mean, just this weekend talking about the immigration issue, Kristi Noem said that the Mexican government was encouraging the protests in LA. And she has all types of Molotov cocktails, for pardon the pun, are thrown at her, and she doesn't lose her balance. And I think she is a very good example for other leaders around the world who are negotiating all these trade issues to follow and pay attention to. Obviously, Mexico has the benefit of being so close to the U.S. and understanding the U.S. much better than other countries might. But yeah, so now moving on to your question about immigration. Look, at the end of the day, it's also an economic issue, because what's happened is that, as Matt has said, the gains of the past 40 years in the world economy have not spread evenly or fairly, depending on how you look at it, among the entire population of all countries involved. And that has caused the malaise that we see now globally. And in that sort of environment, it's very easy to project the fault or the cause of the issue on immigrants and the other. It's a very human reaction to project your sentiments onto others, especially negative sentiments. And but interestingly, you know, the United States is also in a position where you have those sentiments, but you also have to think of the keystone role that many of those immigrants play in the U.S. economy. Just last year, 2024, I remember Jerome Powell making a speech after one of their interest rate meetings, and even though he said, "I am not making an observation on immigration policy. However, immigration over the last few years has really helped cool down inflationary pressures in the United States." And let's not talk about sectors like construction and the housing shortage that the United States suffers right now, how it depends on immigrant labor, obviously agricultural, hospitality. In the state where I live, Florida, is key, and most of those roles are filled by immigrants. And you have many corporations in the United States talking about that. So it will be interesting to see how these corporations, whether they can have convince the administration of the important role that immigration plays in the United States versus the raw visceral sentiment that's playing among its base, and be able to balance both and formulate an immigration policy that benefits the U.S. and eventually and its base as well, being part of the United States.
So as you mentioned, the resilience that the U.S. economy is showing, it's also part of the immigrants that are here in this country.
Look, if without immigration, the United States will be in the same position that Western Europe is at right now, with low birth rates. And situations, for example, like the viability long-term of Social Security would be much, much worse. I think it would be probably broke without the economic support that immigrants bring into the equation. And sustaining moderate levels of immigration helps lengthen the time horizon for Social Security before it reaches that point where it starts going bankrupt. So it is extremely important. And not just for the safety net. When you're looking at, you're seeing right now many communities in the United States as a result of immigration policies where economic movement has really slowed down because people don't want to go to the supermarket. They don't want to attend. They don't want to go to movies. They want to stay home as much as possible. And these folks are an important part of the consumer base of the United States, and they take an outsized role in states like Texas or California or Florida. And if you subtract them, you know, you are reducing economic output, not just from the services and the jobs that they perform, but also the money that they spend and the contributions that they make to the tax base.
So I wanted to open the floor to questions, but before that, if any of you want to make some closing remarks or anything that we haven't touched that you want to comment on.
I'll just pick up, I think, where Jose ended, which is just to say, I think from the outside looking in, it can sometimes be hard to understand the internal American political dynamics because they are complex. We have an odd voting system, and things have changed a lot. And so the thing that I think is really important, just as a reference point, for others trying to understand what's happening here, is that his base is with him. Trump's base is with him. He's incredibly popular with Republicans, very unpopular with Democrats. So as Jose was saying, we're very polarized. But he ran on tariffs. He is now trying to implement tariffs. And every time he loses a court case, it just shows that he's here fighting against the system. And that is just more meat for his base. And so I've met with Europeans and people from Latin America who are like, how can Americans still support this? It's so volatile, it's hurting businesses. But a lot of Americans feel that they were left out, left behind, that the gains of the last 25, 30 years did not include them. And so they are willing to stomach this. They might not like the tactics. They might not like some of the words Trump uses or the way that he conveys his point. But they're willing to stomach it because they fundamentally think that he is fighting for them and that he is fighting against a system that has not supported them, has not benefited them. And that is really what undergirds, I think, this entire policy and process. And what I'm looking for as someone who is interested in follows American politics is over the next 12 months, how much does that translate to the electoral prospects for members of his own party? And if you start to see, House Democrats really going after their Republican counterparts on some of these policies, if you start to see some of these campaigns in what we call the purple districts, which are very few and far between now, but they matter because he only has a 3-seat majority in the House and just a few more in the Senate. So if we start to see some of these criticisms really getting play on the campaign front, then it'll be interesting to see if and how he moderates what he's doing at all. But he's not running again. And I'm not sure that he is so concerned about the prospects of some of his downstream members. Other Republican leaders are, certainly, and so you see a different dynamic with congressional leadership, but he's here doing what he said he was going to do.
I'd like to take that a step further, this time from the perspective of foreign leaders and foreign businesses who are trying to figure out, how do I navigate this situation? And I can't emphasize more or enough, the fact that they need to build coalitions, cultivate them within the United States, especially within those sectors that Sarah just mentioned. If, let's say, the wine growers in Ribera del Duero in Spain are, obviously they're very concerned, and you would think from conventional wisdom that California growers are sitting pretty because of the prospects for them. But when you look at the issue closely, all the cork that they import comes from Spain and Portugal. The bottles come from Mexico and Canada. So understanding those dynamics and being able to extend your hand and working with those folks can go a long way. Or just for imports in general, look at states, red states with important seaports: South Carolina, Florida, Texas. If flower growers in Colombia or other sectors can get the ear of chambers of commerce in South Carolina that are paying close attention to the traffic flows in the Port of Charleston, that eventually gets to Lindsey Graham, who can definitely put a good word for those flows and for those folks with the administration. And and then comes the messaging. As long as those actors outside the U.S. can frame their message from a point of view that takes into account the America First frame that's being used right now, and project their position as beneficial to that America First argument, they can do that. And so I would strongly encourage those people to look closely, form alliances, or if they can't, look for others who can help them put those alliances together and build bridges.
I also want to say that one prediction I have is that there won't be a product that's duty-free in the United States for the coming years. Now, that might be a little bit bold to say, but I think the 10% reciprocal tariff is here to stay for the remainder of the Trump administration. Now, that tariff is built upon a law that is being challenged in court, but just yesterday the courts allow a stay of the tariffs being in place while that challenge continues. However, I don't think we need to be I wouldn't be too concerned about even that law being struck down or the action that was used through that law being struck down. Even if it does, which is already questionable that it does, but even if it does, the president is going to get another, he has other actions he could take in place through executive order or even through some degree of, if he needs a little bit of Congress, at least at the moment he has a majority and he can justify something. For example, I expect that if this AIPA law gets struck down, he will move forward with what's called Section 122 action, which allows him to put tariffs up to 15% for 150 days at least, but Congress can extend it, and he can also say the tariffs are down for 1 day, but they're up again tomorrow for another 150 days, and challenge me in court if you don't think that's how the law is supposed to be applied. So the point being, he likes tariff, as it's been said. He thinks it is a conflicting message that he can do a deal, but at the same time be calling for U.S. manufacturing. But I think the way he's going to settle that is that there will be a base tariff for everyone. There won't be duty-free entry into the United States. So there will be, if you don't like the tariff, you manufacture in America. Now, again, he might not go as high or as intense as some of those reciprocal rates are supposed to be. Those are meant to be negotiated. But I do think that it will be very unlikely that we see duty-free for entry into the U.S. for the coming years.
Thank you so much. Let's open the floor for questions. Please state your name and organization if you want to take a question. We have a mic. You can use mine.
Hi, everyone. I'm Diana Marrero. I'm head of partnerships at Foreign Policy Magazine. And we work with a lot of clients on thought leadership, very similar to what you do. And I was curious if you could lift the veil a little bit and tell us more about how your clients are navigating more public sort of statements and communication strategy. Has that shifted in the last few months? We have started to see people being a little more willing to speak up. Just curious how you're seeing those dynamics play out as communications professionals and public affairs professionals.
Yeah, I can make a start. I'd say it's varied. I mean, for one thing, the relevance has obviously only increased. So every major company with a stake is looking very carefully how to impact what is unfolding, whether you can impact it, and then what's the communication strategy for that. And I mean, it's interesting, we're just coming off the earnings season, right? And for the first time, we've been tracking this for a couple of years, but I'd say like geopolitical and policy issues usually maybe 10 to 15% of earnings calls feature that. Now virtually every call had questions on tariffs, how are you navigating that, what's your position, what's your take on where the US government stands. So it's been a tricky piece to navigate from a corporate comms perspective. Some clients were more outspoken, some they try to get their policy narrative interweaved in that. But like, I think to your point that you just made, it's how do I try to get that to feed into the narrative that actually will create an impact with this administration we've gotten? How does it fit with the America first narrative? And what I've observed, what I've seen, and what we've been advising clients also is ultimately it all comes down to growth, right? This administration, as I think every administration should, but this administration in particular, ultimately they're also in to sell a win, and that can be the deal. But at the end of the day, in 1 year or 2 years, we'll also see the bottom line of that, and that will be, is the US economy growing? And I mean, we know now that the Trump administration is also paying attention at this from a bond market perspective. So it's got very real consequences, and those consequences matter for companies too. And so to the degree that company can frame this conversation and their perspective in terms of what does it mean for future growth for the US, for investment, for the attractiveness of the US to attract investments going forward, I think that's where I see most of the conversation shape. And then of course you have companies, and especially those with founders who are more willing, to your point, to speak out and take a political position on issues. My sense overall would be, though, that for for publicly listed companies at least, they're very focused, and I think they should be, to really only make sure that how they position themselves is in line with the interests that they're pursuing, and how they're conveying them, and how that connects with the administration.
Yeah, and knowing those audiences here in the U.S., and I'm referring to, again, foreign companies, knowing those audiences, yes, ultimately, Sarah said, we're talking about an audience of one, Donald Trump, but he does pay attention. He's an avid consumer of media, social and cable, if he hears it from his base, he will pay attention to that. And like Matt has said, guiding clients through that process can help them, in their positioning for their company.
One other piece to that I'll say is we're trying to help our clients think long term and not react only to the current environment without thinking about how that might have repercussions down the road. As we discussed, there's an election in 16 months. The political dynamics in Washington can change, and so we want to help our clients be able to withstand any volatility and any changes in those dynamics, and so don't course correct too much. You want to continue to be stable and stick to your values and stick to your mission while also being cognizant of what's happening here in DC.
Good morning.
Let me introduce you very quick, by the way. Frank Mora, former ambassador of the United States in front of the OAS. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. So, experiencing a little bit of cognitive dissonance that hopefully you can address. So, on the one hand, all of you have said and talked about the uncertainty, the volatility, the improvisation, that's my word, not yours, about the moment. And so it's very difficult to plan long term, difficult to plan for short term. At the same time, there was no discussion about the budget before the Congress, and that the Senate is considering, and that, among other things, adds to the deficit, which freaks out the market in many ways, creates uncertainty about the bond market. Yet, you see the market, you see investors, you see companies investing and going about, and in many ways doing quite well in this particular environment beyond a week or two after Liberation Day. You hear economists, World Bank say global growth is going to go from 2.6 to 1.4, including the US economy. So the indicators you see out there and the environment, I'm not an investor, but it kind of freaks you out a little bit. Yet the companies don't seem to be much bothered by that. They continue to do the same business and work and going about the same way they were doing before Liberation Day. So for anyone on the panel, can you help me reconcile all that?
I mean, I do think that they do care. They just might not do it, to Diana's point earlier, as publicly as others did. Might have done in the past, but Liberation Day, certainly Trump made comments that he was hearing from bond investors a lot, and that they were jittery, his word. And I'm sure that played a role into pausing the tariffs the following day on April 3rd. So I do feel, and please correct me if I'm wrong, also with your clients as well, that there is a high level of concern, is just how they're choosing to project it right now.
But it seems like they're ignoring the president, that they're factoring in, building into their projections and decisions in the market and elsewhere, that the president takes a maximum position but ultimately retreats. And therefore, there's not much to worry about. Certainly, uncertainty is not good, but it's actually, I'm speculating, it's not that uncertain. Am I correct? Again, how do you reconcile all that?
So my sense is that the markets are indeed hopeful, and they're trying to see through and saying ultimately I think there's this belief that there's a reversion to the mean also on policy, that ultimately you end up with something that is not quite as dramatic in terms of its economic impact as the day-to-day policy discussions are. But I'm fully with Jose. If you look at the corporates, and those are mainly our clients, and I include the banks. If you read the statement from the Jamie Dimons, Larry Fink, BlackRock last week, I think they point to concerns that they see on the horizon overall. And corporates, of course, are all scenario planning, cost cutting, thinking about how to navigate through this. And I think with them, there's a lot more awareness of the potential, because it's a real, to your point, it's a real risk. And to your point earlier, we probably end up not with an outcome that is what we had before, but with higher tariffs, and that will feed through to some degree. But the one added qualification I would make is, of course, the markets, if you look at the S&P, and right, it's up from where it was before April 2nd, so I think 3% now. There is the big AI narrative, right, which is, if you kind of dissect it a bit, which is really driving the gains to this part. So it's not across the S&P 500. I think if you dissect sector by sector, you do see the assumed implications of the tariffs in the market rate.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think companies are very hesitant to react in a loud, public, swift way, but behind the scenes, we're definitely seeing strategic planning that reflects the tariffs and also what might come down the pike. So trying to move supply chains, trying to onshore more manufacturing to the United States. Companies are looking at that. If they're able to make an announcement and do it right away, that's not always possible. But I do think it's factoring into company decision making. But I think there's another aspect of this, which is that, and I know I keep saying this, there's an election in 16 months, and we might be able to withstand some of this as long as we don't overreact, overcorrect, and then let's kind of see where things lie.
And I'll add that there is a level to which there's a level where these tariffs become prohibited in terms of trade, right? So like the China, what we saw after April 2, it was like, we can do business at 125%, 140% tariff. By the way, there's a bunch of other tariffs added to that sometimes the market is not seeing, like in 301, there's tariffs on needles and medical gloves and lithium batteries that are not part of that equation. But again, the market reacts 140% tariff. We can't, this is prohibited. We can't do anything about it, right? But at 50%, what I'm seeing is a lot of resiliency and creativity, and going through some things that Sarah just mentioned as far as what can we make in the U.S. And for me, questions are being asked: what is the essential component of this? And what I can make that in Thailand, or I can make that in the U.S., or I can make that in this. So there's a tipping point, and for each industry and company is going to be different. But I think that this idea of there is a tariff level that the market is like, all right, companies for the most part are going to find a way to work within that. Maybe there's a little bit of a loss, but they're playing the long game too. Or maybe they're going to pass a little bit of that tariff to the consumer. Maybe they're going to share it with the manufacturer a little bit. Where I think things do, but because it changes every day, I think those who are analysts who are making predictions that, well, is it a steel tariff at 50, or is it at 25? Is it at China at 100? Is China 100, or is it 55? That's where I think it's very hard to model and predict if it's going to be economic growth or slowdown. But I do see I work with the companies now, this is in micro, and lots of resilience, lots of creativity, lots of finding ways to stay competitive and in the market. Even if you have lost some, you're still finding ways. And that's where we are right now. It is that shifting and evolving, and where do we, and I think that's not, therefore, it's not yet reflected in numbers, and the predictions might be off because of that lack of understanding the creativity of companies as well.
Hi, I'm Cristobal Vasquez. I'm a freelance journalist for the BBC. I wanted to ask you about Elon Musk's comments 5 days ago. He forecasted a recession in the second half of the year. He has a lot of information perhaps we don't have because of Doge. Do you share that forecast?
He did tweet recently that he regrets a lot of what he said. Some of what he said. Yeah, again, I don't. It depends on what product specifically we're looking at. Again, it depends on how much room there is to make changes, and so I will just be repeating myself in this answer. Is that some companies, some products have a lot of room to still be creative and find a way around it, or at least not be as impacted as much, or eat some of this tariff. For some, it's going to be more difficult, but the end goal here, as we all know, is Trump is one to negotiate and sell that he has a deal. So that's where I'm not as convinced that it's as tragic. It's going to be tragic for some, but I think for the overall economy, so long as there is negotiation, so long as we are declaring this, but actually having tariffs at this level, it won't be as catastrophic as we think.
Look, from my end, and I'm not an investment expert by any sense of the imagination. I'm looking at the same sources you probably are. But a couple of months ago, JP Morgan was putting chances of a recession north of 50%. All the multilaterals are forecasting, institutions are forecasting economic contraction at different levels. And that's been actually part of the switch in messaging from the administration. We went from a boom, economic boom right away to there's going to be some hard times. Everybody needs to be able to work through those. Famously, President Trump's comments on, a little girl doesn't need $50. She can do with 2 or 5 or the pencils. So I think the question is how deep that slowdown might be, not if it's going to occur. You see several other indicators, like for example, in Florida, where I'm from, housing prices are starting to fall. And the first quarter in the U.S., the economy actually contracted. So if we have the similar situation with a second quarter, that is in definition a recession. So I think it's the level of slowdown, not so much whether it's going to slow down or not. Whether there will be a boom at some point, there probably might be, but first things are going to continue to slow down a bit.
Hi, my name is Celeste. I'm from the Embassy of Brazil. We were quite relieved when the reciprocal tariffs were unveiled, and we were at 10%. And most of Latin America was set at 10% as well. And we do know that a lot of the rhetoric that President Trump uses around the tariffs is that he wants to reshore some production into the US. But we know that it's not entirely economically feasible to reshore every single thing. We recently had an exchange with Secretary Lutnick at Congress about you cannot build bananas in the US. So if maybe this signaling to Latin America, if there is an interest into nearshoring some of the supply chains into the region, if you guys see if it's a conscious movement on the American government.
I think David probably has some insights into that. All I can say is that from the South American perspective, you have some, especially in the southern part of the region, you have some factors playing in your favor in that, and that's mainly the rare minerals, the lithium triangle in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Bolivia. And I've noticed there seems to be a move, at least in Chile, on making sure that they're not merely providing raw materials to the rest of the world, but that they are actually exporting some value added to that. So I would imagine, but again, David is probably closer to that, to those discussions from corporations to see what they're thinking of that and the administration.
So this is just a personal view based on experience with other companies and again on the policy space. I don't think there's room in the America First policy for nearshoring. Meaning it's America first, America second, America third. And that doesn't mean the continent. That means the United States of America only. So I would not think that the United States is somehow going to be more lenient or leaning towards Latin America or Brazil as a friend, which strategically makes sense in terms of if you want to be to counter China, or if you do want to say, hey, there's some things. I think the president actually said about 2 weeks ago, I actually don't want to make shirts and socks in the United States. So you think, all right, well, there's Haiti, there's Latin American countries, Nicaragua, there's Central America that can make those shirts, right? So there's been a little bit of that, but I don't think nearshoring or friendshoring, which is something we were talking about a couple of years ago, it's part of the vernacular of this administration. It's America first, and if you happen to do something that is good for America, that's fine. I don't care if you do it in Thailand, in Latvia, or in Brazil. Is it good for America? That's how they're going to see it, and I think we talked about this before on that. How do you sell that issue? So it might be a Brazil issue, but you have to sell it as an American issue.
Correct. I think it's the framing where it comes. As long as you can make sure that it's framed from that America First perspective, you stand a good chance of getting those policies enacted. If not, then if it's seen as a zero-sum game among the base, then probably not, yeah.
I'll add, I think China is a big factor in some of these discussions, and we saw that with the rare earths and critical minerals. And so to the extent that countries can position themselves as a better alternative to China in terms of supply chains and manufacturing, I don't know that like David said, I don't think we necessarily are using the term nearshoring or friendshoring anymore. But there's certainly points of leverage because there is still a desire to move things outside of China.
And then also how the Belt and Road Initiative and other issues like that factor into the calculus, whether
Absolutely.
the U.S. wants China to expand its footprint in Latin America and other parts of the world. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I mean, I think that's what the U.S. official policy is. If you look at some of the decisions this administration has taken, particularly when it comes to cutting USAID and foreign assistance and some of our soft power in the region, it's a little contradictory. But the position still is that they don't want to cede the hemisphere to China. Whether or not their policies are actually putting that into practice, I think, is open for debate. But it's still the position.
Yeah. Yeah, we saw it with Panama. As you pointed out,
Yeah.
we discussed earlier.
Yes, yeah. So I mean, trying to pressure Panama on operation of the Panama Canal and pulling out of BRI, that's one example. That was a very specific moment in time, I think, with a lot of public pressure and public attention. I'm not sure that the policies towards the region have continued in that vein with any real systematic thought behind it. But obviously Secretary Rubio is extremely familiar with the region. He's also been very active on China, and so it's certainly something that he has a lot of experience in, and I would expect him to continue to focus on. But how that all plays into kind of the overarching negotiations with all of these countries on tariffs, I think that's a little bit up in the air, but I would expect to see a lot more activity on that front.
Yes, how the potential change in the House can affect or influence this conversation, and what advice you can give to leaders and stakeholders on how to navigate this potentially new scenario, political scenario we will experience soon.
Well, I wouldn't say we will, because I very much am not in the business of making predictions when it comes to American politics anymore. But it's certainly possible that control of the House or the Senate could change after the next election. So I think America is a two-party system, and anybody who's operating in Washington, D.C. needs to build relationships with both of those parties, regardless of who's in power on any particular day, because things can change really quickly. And the minority party does have some power here still, as much as that might not seem to be true on a day-to-day basis right now. I think the biggest thing that we might see if Democrats were to regain one or both houses is their power to conduct oversight and investigations into the administration. There's absolutely no oversight happening right now on the part of Congress when it comes to the administration's actions, and I would expect that to change very quickly and with quite some depth if the House or the Senate were to flip back to the Democrats. And it would also stymie his ability to pass legislation. So they're currently working on a reconciliation bill. I won't get into all of the details of that because it's really arcane and complex and specific to the United States, but it's a way for the majority party to sidestep the minority's ability to influence legislation in the Senate. Whether they're able to pass it, I think people still feel like they will. The runway is getting a little bit short, but that mechanism would no longer be available to the president. And so he would have to work through kind of the traditional two-party system, which he wasn't very successful at during his last go-around. That proved to be very difficult for him. And he has a new Republican leader in the Senate who's been around for a long time and very proven and adept at the legislative process. I think the House Speaker is a little newer to the negotiating table, but has proven himself able to bring his party together. And so, I think the Democrats have been in something of disarray since the election, but that can also change quickly if they win and have kind of a new coalition coming in opposition to the current administration. I would expect them to use their gavels in a very serious way to conduct that oversight and to stop the president's agenda.
Also, structurally, the House, the Congress, especially the House, usually flips on the midterm following a presidential election for whatever party you're in. So you have that, and I think that the administration is very cognizant of that. Otherwise, they wouldn't be putting forth all these policies in the one bill that they have on the floor right now in the Senate. And they also showed some concern when they pulled the nomination of Elise Stefanik from New York to be UN ambassador because they feared that that seat would be lost in a primary and their legislative ability would be curtailed in the House. So I think they are definitely thinking of that scenario and trying to get as much done now as possible before 2026.
One quick comment too is that I don't think in terms of if this conversation about is focused on tariff policy and trade policy, let's recall that to some degree President Trump has taken over a portion of the Democratic Party's messaging on trade, which was this has to be fair, this has to be worker-centric, right? So, and we saw it from the Biden administration where they didn't change any of the tariffs that were in place against China. So in terms of the House or the Senate flipping, what does that mean for trade policy? I agree with Sarah, more oversight. Perhaps he can widely use certain laws to declare emergencies. But I think the sentiment that the U.S. should be protectionist to some extent in terms of tariffs for the benefit of workers or to reshape the economy or because there hasn't been equality, I think is shared by a core of the Democratic Party as well as a core of the Republican Party, and that is enough to say that this shift is not temporary, but is permanent, at least for a few more sessions of Congress, if we call it in those terms.
Yeah, I agree. I think one interesting thing would be to see if there's any effort to wrest some of the authority back that Congress has ceded to the executive through laws, well, maybe through laws like IEEPA, but and the Trade Policy Act. But that could gain a little bit of traction, I suppose, if the Democrats were to take over. There's already been some proposals, but I don't see that probably getting enough support to pass both houses and then get signed by President Trump, so.
All right, I think our time is up. Again, thank you so much to FGS Global for hosting us. Thank you for those in attendance. And thank you to our panelists for this insightful conversation. It's going to be online next week, right? So anyone who wants to review it, it's going to be there.
In Spanish and in English.
In Spanish and in English. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.